Okay, good day everyone. In today's video, we will be learning about hooks in React. And we'll be talking about the useState hook, the useEffect, the createContext hook, as well as the useContext hook. So I'm going to begin by defining what a hook is. A hook is a function in React that allows functional components to have stateful logic and to reuse the same logic between different components. So a state is a variable that holds a value that changes over time. Things like the number of likes a post has, the number of comments a post has, or the age of a user. So these things are bound to change. So that's what we mean by state. So let's talk about the type of components we have in React. In React, we have two types of components. We have the client-side components, and these are components that run on your browser. And we have the server-side component that runs on your server. By default, every file you create in React, like this page.jsx for instance now, runs on my server. This file runs on my server. In order for me to ensure that I can write a React hook in this file, I have to make sure that this file begins to run on the browser. And how I can do that is by passing the use client text just at the top of my screen. Use client like this. So this use client here just means that this file now runs on the browser, which supports hooks in React. So let's start by talking about the useState hook. So the useState hook uses array structuring to store the current value and also to set a new value. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to create a variable cons of x equals to 20. And I'm going to do the same thing, but this time around, I'm going to use a hook so that I'll be able to update the value of my variable. So I would const of array brackets, because I want to the structure now, is going to be equal to my use state hook, just like this. Now I have to ensure that I import this hook from the right place. So I'll follow this first pop-up here, and it's import use state coming from React. So if you don't see the pop-up, you could just write your import statement this way, and it should work fine. Then since it's a function, I have to pass in the curly braces at the end. It's a function. Now the useState allows us to declare a variable, a regular variable. I want to call this one count, as well as a setter variable. So I'll call this set count. So a setter variable is just a variable that would always assign to the main variable any value we give to it. Think of it like a dispatch rider. When you order for something and your goods are given to the dispatch rider, what the dispatch rider does is he or she finds its way to you. So that's what this set count does. Every time we assign a value to set count, it moves it on to count. Now, the value inside of count is whatever is written in here initially. So if I write the value 35 here, this means that count as a variable is holding the value 35. So to confirm that, I'm going to send count to my console, so that on this end, I should see that count is holding the value 35. And we have it here, 35 for count. So if I change this value here, the value for count changes. So that's the main variable as well as the setter variable. So what I want us to do now is I'm going to design a button very shortly and a text here that every time I click on the button, I'm going to update the value of that text. So I'll come to my main element, create a div in here. In this div, I'm going to create a button element and give it a text that says increase. And create a p element and give it 0 in there. So I'm just going to have basic style in here. So since I'm using Tailwind CSS, I could okay. So I could just give it a background color, blue 600. Make the text white. Give it a little border radius. Let's make that smaller. Then padding on the x-axis and on the y-axis. Let's see what that gives us. So something like this is fine. And I'd want to increase the font size. Okay, just like that. Then my p element, I would do the same thing, and I'll increase the font size as well to something that large so that I can do basic styling here. So okay, so I have this. Then I'd want to just add margin on the x-axis, just so we have some space here. So what I intend to do now is every time I click on this button, this number should increase. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this hard-coded value of 0 here and replace it with the value inside of count. So how I do that is I'll pass in my curly braces, then pass in the variable name of count. When I write that, this should show 35, just like this, because 35 is the value inside of the variable count. So I'm going to write a function, and I'm going to create a handler function this time around. So const of handle update is going to be equal to a callback function, like that. So the essence of this function is every time I click on the button element, I want to increase this by 1. So the default value of count now, I will set it back to 0 so that we start from 0 and we go upward. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to set count. So this is how we assign new values to the setter variable, just like this. And anything I write inside here would then be assigned to the value of set count. And once set count, or rather to the variable of set count, and once set count receives a value, it moves it on to count. So I'm going to call this function now as an onClick to the button element. So as a prop to the button element, I'd pass in onClick and pass in a callback function that will point to handle update as a function. So that when I do that, I wait for this to load. Okay, it's almost, yeah, it's done. When I do that and I click on this value updates to 40 immediately. That's because what I said was every time we call the handle update function, assign the value of 40 to set count. And once set count gets a value, it moves it on to count. So I'm going to remove this console.log here and write this function. So I'm going to now say update the value of count by 1 every time I click on that button element. And that's what we need to do. So when I refresh the page and we're back here, when I click on increase, it becomes 1. I click increase, it becomes 2. I click increase, it becomes 3, on and on. So with my use state now, I've been able to work on this effect just by having a variable as well as a setter variable, and then writing my function such that every time I click on the button, I update the current value of count by 1 and assign that new value to the set count variable. And when set count, like I said before, gets any value, it passes it on to count. So that's it. So that's the use state hook. So that's the use state hook. The next hook we are going to be looking into now is going to be the use effects. Now, the use effects hook in React is a built-in hook that allows us manage side effects in functional components. So basically, side effects are just any piece of code or a block of code that has an effect outside of the component itself. For instance, things like fetching data from an API, sending a certain value to the console, or updating our DOM. So I'm going to attach my use effects now to this function. So the way we write use effects is very similar to that of useState. We call the use effects like this. Now we have to import it from the same location as the useState, just like this use effect. They are both coming from React because these are built-in hooks in React. So use effect is a function that accepts two values. The first value is the use effect is going to accept a callback function just like that. After a callback function, it accepts an empty array. So this array that it accepts, we call it a dependency array. So in my callback function, I'll just leave a comment here that says code to run. What this means is every time the value I pass inside my dependency array changes, whatever code I pass inside of the curly braces is going to run. So what I want to do is I want to send to the console the updated value of count every time I run this code. So I'll then come to the dependency array and write count here. Because what I'm saying is as long as count changes, we run this piece of code. So when we check out the browser, so I'm going to refresh that. Okay, and I click on increase. While it is updating this by 1 based on the handle update function, useEffect is sending the new value of count to the console. When I click again, it happens a second time, a third time, happens on and on. So this is the effect of the useState, and this is as a result of the useEffect. Now, if we write an empty dependency array here, basically meaning that we don't pass in any value, the command we are passing to the computer is, I want this thing to run just once. So that's called run on mount. So the moment my page has finished refreshing and loading, run the code just once and no further. That's why initially I'm going to see 0 here. And when I update count, I don't see anything on my console anymore because I'm no longer sending to the console based on what is changing in the value of count. So that's useEffect. So we could now use it to build even bigger systems, bigger applications, and more robust functions. So we've been able to talk about the use states. We've been able to cover the useEffect. Now let's talk about context. So the context is split into two. We have the createContext as well as the useContext. So the useContext hook and the createContext hook is necessary whenever we want to share data from one component to another component. Because more often than not, the data that is available on different parts of a web-based application, we would not always fetch them. We could fetch them in one location and pass it across to the various places where they are needed. Now that's where the context comes in. So the first thing I'm going to do here now, while we are talking about the use context hook, is I'm going to create an object I want to share to different components. So just in here now, I'm going to create an object and I'll call this object, I could just call it user details. User details is going to be equal to an object like this. So I'm going to have a user's name. Name is going to be set to John Doe. And I would also want to get the user's ID. So the ID will be a combination of letters and numbers. So I could do JN123. So this user details object now, I'm going to pass it to another component. So what I'm going to do is I want to create a component. Now how we create components in React is we're going to create a folder and we're going to call that folder components like this. So every external component now that we're going to create would then be nested inside of this component folder. So in this component folder now, I will just create a file where I want to call this. So the way we create that is we create a file now. And I'm going to call this component contact.jsx, just like that, contact.jsx. So that's it. Now in here, I'm just going to export something. So okay, so I've been able to export something. So I'm going to now return a main element. A main element like that. So this is my contact.jsx. So in here, I'll just pass in a text that says, okay, contact us. So one thing we know about React is every time a user gets to see a page, the name of that file must be called, that's I'm speaking for the app router, must be called the page.jsx. So the contact.jsx we just created, users won't be able to see it unless we call it in this kind of file. So what I'm going to do now is in here, I'm going to import that file just under this my div element. So I'll just call it contact because that's what we called it when we exported it. And if you look closely, you realize that the contact is coming from components, which is the proper location. So I have been able to import it as well, contact, from our components folder, from our contact file. So down here, I will just give it a closing tag like this. So that when I check out my browser now, it should show me that contact us text that we wrote in here. Let me refresh that. So there we have it, contact us. So this is coming from a whole separate component. So I want us to share data now from the main parent page.jsx to this contact us file. And the data that we're going to be passing across is going to be this object that we called user details at this stage. User details. So the first thing we have to do is we have to create a file where this our context is going to be created. So I'm going to create this one inside component now. So I'm going to create this as a new file. So once again, the format for creating a component follows capital letter initially, then lowercase. So basically, we use Pascal casing system here. So I'm going to call my file now user details context to show that this is my user details context.js. So I'm using a .js in this case because every time I write JSX, I'm going to be writing both HTML and JavaScript to support both of them. But in this case, I'm just going to be writing JavaScript. I don't intend to write HTML here. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to export a variable. So export const. Now the name of the variable I'm going to export is going to be the same name of the file I just created, which is user details context. User details context. Now this is going to be equal to a create context function. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to create our context before we can use it. So this is us creating the context. So I'm going to now call create context. And it's coming from the same location as the use context, if you recall, as the useState and useEffect rather. So useState here, useEffect are both coming from React. And in here now we have create context also coming from React. And this once again is a function. So we had established earlier on that React hooks would always work on client-side components, files that run on your browser. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to ensure that this runs on my browser by marking it with use client. Just like that, use client. So my context has been created. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to my page.jsx file now. I'm going to come back here. And just before my contact component, I'm going to import my user details component as well, user details context, just like this. And I've imported it again. So user details context is coming from component, coming from user details context. So, but before I just give it a closing tag, now what I want to do is I want to create a component that would have access to this data I want to share across, which is user details as an object here. So the format for achieving that is this. I'm going to do a dot provider. Dot provider. After this dot provider, I then give it a closing tag. Now the essence of the closing tag is this. As a property to this, I'm going to pass in value. Value. Now the value I'm going to pass in here now would be the information I want to share across various components, which in this case happens to be a user details object. Now any component I wrap between this context here should have access to my object of user details. So I'm going to move contacts in here now. So in my contact.jsx file now, I should be able to access my user details that is coming from my page.jsx file here. So I'm going to come back to contacts now. And in here, I'm going to use it. So the first thing I'm going to do is, just before my return statement, I'm going to create a variable that would hold the value that is coming from here. That's going to hold this value, which happens once again to be user details. So const. And this time around, I'm going to call it details. So const of details is going to be called something. Now that we are done creating our context, we are now tasked with using this context. So I'm going to import the use context hook. Use context from React like that as a function. So once again, we know that we're using a hook here. So I'm just going to ensure that this file runs on my browser with a use client like that. So use context. But writing this use context function is not enough for us to access the data that is inside user details. So I have to come in here now and call the name of the context I created at this stage. And at this point, we called it user details context. So I'm going to pick user details context and I'm going to call it here. So, which we also have to import user details context, which is coming from user details context here. So that's it. So to prove that we're on the right track, I'm going to send these details now to my console before I send it to the DOM, just to be sure that at this stage now we should access the entire object here, giving us access to the ID as well as the name. So in here, I could now pass in a text that says contact details. Since it's an object, I could now do a dot name. So I'll get access to just the user's name, contact John Doe with ID, for instance. And then I'd come again and do the same details dot ID. So you should show me rather contact John Doe with the user's ID, and that's it. So we have been able to pass data now from our page.jsx file after creating our context in this user details context file onto contact.jsx. So this is how we work with hooks in React. So we have the widely used hooks, the useState, the useEffect, and the useContext. And all these hooks must run on client-side components because we are still using hooks to manage state, and we know now that a state is a variable that holds data or information that changes over time. So that's it for this video.